Hi everyone, this is Linda with Overbrook Quilt Connection, and today we are doing block 2 of the Illusions Block of the Month sampler. And I'm going to put my camera down so you can see what I'm working on. I am at my ironing station today, and we're going to be showing some pressing and of course some cutting techniques also. The first thing we're going to talk about, now this sampler, as you know, is a skill builder. So each month we'll be adding in new units. We'll be talking about how to construct them. But once I've done 1 month of doing this, I won't demo it again. I will touch on it again, but I'll refer back to which month we did it in the first time, so you can go back and refresh your memory if you'd like. So we'll be doing half square triangles and flying geese as part of this block. So the first thing you'll do, you're cutting 2 squares, and again refer to your pattern for which fabrics to use and which background to use. You're going to cut 2 squares of each of 4 colors, and the same of background. On your background, you will draw a line diagonally, corner to corner. Then you'll place it right sides together with your colored square, like so. And then you will sew 1/4 inch on either side of that line. You'll use your 1/4 inch foot and you'll stitch that. So that's what that will look like. Hopefully you can see my stitching lines there, either side. So then this becomes a cutting line. Now, what I used to mark this with was, in this case, I used a friction gel pen. They're designed to go away when you use heat on them. I use that in a place, that type of pen, in a place where it's not going to show later, because it does leave just a little bit of residue behind. So I wouldn't mark with it on something that is going to be showing on the front side when it's done. So when I press these, then that line's going to go away. But I'm also going to then cut on that line. And you can, there's nothing precise about that anymore. So if you want to use scissors, you can. I just, cut on it just because it was, my cutter was right here. Last month, I also talked about finger pressing. And so I'm going to do that here. With a half square triangle, this edge is the bias stretchy edge, and these 2 edges are your straight of grain, so they're not as stretchy. So when you're pressing, again, I use my fingernail to make sure I don't have any creases left in there, and then I'm going to press that. Now I don't iron, scrub iron it. It's more of an up and down motion. The reason for that, this is a stretchy seam. So if you press around on it too much, you can get it to the seam to kind of smile or frown, because it gets out of shape. I also don't use steam on this type of unit either, because I tend to be a little heavy with my iron, and my iron is heavy by itself, and so I can distort my fabrics pretty easily. So again, I'm just kind of rolling that edge of that iron up over that seam, and then just pressing it and picking it back up. All right, you will be making 4 each one of those. You cut it apart and you have 2, and you make 2 sets of those. But you're only going to use 3 of the 4. You will also be squaring them up, and let me show you that. It's a tiny bit different than our previous squaring up because you only have one seam to worry about and the total outside edge. You don't have that other diagonal seam like we had last month. So I'm just lining it up. I'm making sure the 2.5 inches are contained within the size of the piece that I have here, and that my 45-degree line is on the seam. And then I'm just simply going to cut both of those sides, then turn it around and do the same thing. And I don't know if you can, I've talked about leaving my thumb off. I kind of rest my thumb on the back side and have it hanging off. So it's kind of my brace, kind of like an easel stand is when you have you know, a picture on an easel, just so it doesn't move. So then that's squared up then to 2.5 inches, and you'll do that with all of them. Then the next thing we do is we make these this type of unit, and we're going to take the half square triangles that we've made, and one of each color. You're going to add these little side triangles onto. All right, so make sure that on the colored side, and watch your picture in your book to make sure you have the, so if it's laying in front of me, it would be on the left side, so the colored side would be on the bottom. And I'm going to place one of my triangles so this edge is even, right sides together. Of course, with this background, you can't tell what's right side and what's wrong side. Then sew that seam. Again, you have that little tail hanging out. You press towards the triangle. Again, you will be pressing lightly. I finger pressed it back and then just pressed it down and back up again. Then you take your second triangle, lay it on the other colored side, again with the edges straight there, and put them right sides together and sew that seam. Then you will end up with a unit that looks like that. Now, all I do at that point, and this is what the back side of it looks like because you're pressing away from that half square triangle. So the only thing I do at that point is just trim that little point off so I have a straight edge. All right, then your A triangles that you cut one 5-inch square in half once on the diagonal, and one of your fabric a 5-inch square that you cut once on the diagonal. You're going to add those to this unit. So the long sides are together. Again, that's a bias edge that's stretchy, so be sure you don't, stretch it out as you're doing it. And you'll sew that seam. Now, for me and my seam allowances, the big triangle was just a slight bit bigger than this piece. So I centered it on that so my corners, my points came out in the same place, and sewed that seam. And you're pressing it towards the big triangle. So again, I finger pressed that out with my fingernail and then press down on it with my iron. Okay, it says this unit should measure 4.5 inches, and mine was slightly bigger on this side. So in order to square that up, I put I do it like any other squaring up, you know, putting my 45-degree on that seam, but I did not trim anything off of that unit that I sewed. I'm only trimming off of the big triangle. So I'm only going to cut one side at this point. Then I'm going to flip it around and then line up my 4.5 and trim the other edge of the big triangle. And as you can see, I trimmed very little off of that. Okay, you'll do 2 of the colors this way. And in the pattern, they use the yellow and the purple, or the lavender, or whatever you want to call it. Then this color. Then with the same technique for this, they pair a fabric 3 or the dark red large triangle with it. Same exact thing when I squared this up. The only thing I trimmed off was just a tiny little bit on this large triangle. And they did those with the green and the blue. So you'll end up with 2 units that look like this and 2 units that look like this. All right, that is all of those units. Then we're going to make flying geese. Now there's multiple ways, there are multiple ways of doing half square triangles too, but this is the first most common way that we used. There are multiple ways of making flying geese also. And this way that we're doing is what I would call flippy corners, or flipping the corners, or however you want to refer to that. You start with a rectangle, and in this case, it's the dark red. And of course, refer to your cutting in your pattern. You're going to also have the 2.5-inch squares. You'll use 8 of the 12 that you cut, and you'll draw a line corner to corner on those. Again, I used a friction pen. You could use anything because it's going to be inside and it's not going to show. So the first thing you do is take your square and lay it on your rectangle with the outside edges even. Lay it in one corner, and you'll sew on the line. And I'm going to refer to this as the outside. I sew right on the outside edge of that line. And the reason I do that is because you're going to fold it back, and the thread and the fabric fold take up just a little bit of room, and you want that piece, when you fold it back, to line up exactly with the original size of your rectangle. So here's that pressed back, and you can see it's the same size as the original square. There's just, the stitching. Okay, you will, when you press it, again, that is I use my fingers to do the initial folding, and then I just put my iron down and pick it right back up again. This underneath will be trimmed off. You can I'm going to use my rotary cutter since it's right here. I just trim it 1/4 of an inch away from my seam allowance, but it is, again, does not have to be completely precise, so you can use scissors if you want. All right, then we'll do the exact same step on the other end. So this is one where I have already sewn and pressed and trimmed off the first side. So then I've stitched down the second side. Again, I'm calling this the outside. So I've stitched right along the outside edge of that marked line. Then again, I will press it back. And if you press it back and it does not match the outside edge of your rectangle, you can take it out and do it again. But what you want it to, once you press it back, it should still measure the original size of, the size of your original rectangle. You will press it back and trim it off. So that is a flying goose. This, in referring to flying geese, the pointed part is the goose because the geese fly in formation. And this is the two side pieces are referred to as the sky. All right, you'll make 4 of these. And when you're done with that, that's all the unit assembly that you have. We're ready to sew the block itself together. So I'll show you that step next. The next thing we're going to do is assemble as we're assembling our block, is make these top and bottom units that will be having, well, actually it's all 4 sides. Sorry, I misspoke. It's all 4 sides of our block. They'll go around the center section. You'll need to refer to your picture. As you're looking at it, your goose should be situated with the point up on all of them. And then the colors, you'll need to match the colors that are in your book and if you matched the centers to those colors, then this will work. All right, so you lay it out with the color towards the goose and the white on the outside point. Or the background, I mean. All right, so yellow and green on this first one. Green and purple. Purple and blue. Blue and yellow. And as you'll see when we start assembling this, these two will be by each other coming into a corner. These two will be, and these two will be. So the next thing I'm going to do is sew these seams on all of these units, and I will be pressing them out away from the center. Once you have your side units made, you're going to make your center section, and it is a big 4-patch like we did last time when we sewed 4 squares together. We will do the exact same thing, and they're laying it out with yellow at the top left, green at the top right, blue at the bottom left, purple at the bottom right. And they have you sew the 2 sections. So you'll sew this section together, right sides together, and this section, right sides together. You'll sew both of these seams, and then you'll sew the center seam. Now they have you pressing these first seams to the red big triangle. The center section is put together, and it looks like so. Let me see, it's backwards on the camera, so when you're laying it down to look at, this would be your upper left. I did not talk about nesting seams and pinning seams that are not nesting because we did that last month. So I'll move on to the next section, which is to finish assembling this block. You're going to be laying out your pieces so the similar colors are in the same corner. And these pieces should be the same size as your finished center. All right, so, whoops, I dropped it. So all your blues will be together in one corner, all your purples, all your greens, all your yellows. All right, then in these remaining empty spots, we have 4 background squares that fit in those spots. So the assembly will be to sew these 2 to this center. So you'll flip those right sides together and you will sew those and you will press them in towards the center, and you will sew your background squares to either end of your remaining 2 units. And you will press those seams out towards the squares. Let me do that step and I'll show you the next one. I would like to talk about pressing these seams when we sew the first units on. That is a thick seam right there where you're wanting it to press back onto itself. So that becomes really thick right there. And so when I press that, using the wool pressing mat holds the heat in, it retains the heat onto your fabric better. Then I like to use a clapper. A clapper is a thick, heavy piece of wood. And I mean, you can use something else that's heavy. I just tend to like this because it's super easy to just keep on my ironing board and doesn't take up much room. We have these at the shop. Amy can, contact Amy if you're interested. We have them in various sizes, I think about 4 sizes. And this is maple, and it's real heavy. So what you do when you press your seam, so I pressed it back that way, then while it's still warm, I lay the clapper on it and just let it sit for a while, let it cool down that way. And then that makes that a nice sharp press. All right, so I have both of the sides on and I have my corners sewn on. So now it's just time to put the top and bottom on. I will do that and I'll come back and show you the finished block. Those we are going to press out, away from the center. I have been working on our first accent strip for block 2. And it is all flying geese, just like we made in our block for the red geese on the outside edges of our block 2. So I've made them all, and this time we are using the background 4, which, has these little black leaf designs, and we cut the squares and sewed them on and pressed them back just exactly like we did in the block itself. The next step then is to figure out your placement of your colors in your strip, because we're going to sew these all together in one long strip except for 2 blocks that we're going to leave separate. Now, when you sew them together, you're going to sew the base of the goose to the top, the point of the next goose. And I want you to see that X, like we talked about in block 1, this also makes an X design, and you want to stitch it with your stitching right inside that little X. And by doing that, then you keep your point on your goose. All right, so all of them will be sewn together in that fashion. Now, because I wasn't happy with how I had done some of my colors, you know, how I had laid out some of the colors in block 1, I decided to lay my block next to it as I was doing my colors. Now, one thing that's going to happen is that we still have to add the sashing to this. So it's actually going to be up like this. It's going to be offset some. And of course, our seam allowances, once we get it all sewn together, will be, you know, it will reduce our length by quite a bit. So I wanted to be sure, though, that the colors that I was putting together wouldn't be exactly the same. Like, I didn't want the red to be right where the red was here, and I didn't want this violet to be right next to it. So, you know, kind of keep that in mind. There are several greens, and there's the green on here, so perhaps I might want to think about switching those around, although that makes for a lot of dominant color right in one row there. So I think I'm going to put it back the way I had it, even though it's a different green than that. My hope is it will show a little bit more. I could try this other one and see if I like that one better. But, you know, just switch them around until you have your favorite grouping of them. Then we're going to, again, we're going to sew these all together, the fat end to the pointy end of the goose. And I will come back and show you the strip when it's done. All right, the strip is sewn together. Let me move my camera just a little bit so you can see this strip better. It should measure 16.5 inches. And of course, it'll be 4.5 inches wide. These batiks are just so lovely that they just press beautifully. And I should have said also that when you sew this seam here, sew with this side to the top so you can see where your needle's going to be in that V. Other than that, you'll have, oh, and when you press it, you press them all towards the fat part of the goose, the base of the goose. And that's just kind of the direction it wants to go anyway. You'll also have this other piece that, just the two. So we have 8 in one and 2 in the other. Yeah, that's right, 8 and 2. So I will come back and show you accent strip number 2. We are working on accent strip 2 for block 2, and we will be appliquing circles, colored circles onto background and background circles onto colors. And we'll be doing 6 squares. Now, I'm going to assume that you haven't done applique before, so I'm going to give you all the steps just in case you haven't done this before. In your pattern is this circle template, and it measures 2¼ inches across. Now, you can use plastic template or template plastic to trace that onto and cut it out and make yourself a template. You can even use cardboard or something if you want to. I decided I was going to look in my house to see if I could find something that measured 2¼ inches around. And I happened to find the base of a cup that measured exactly 2¼ inches from the outside edge to the outside edge. So I used this as my template, and you will need some heat and bond or some kind of double-sided fusible to, and it has paper on one side, and then it has the fusible stuff. You can kind of see it's shiny on this side. Has the fusible stuff on the other. So these squares are cut a little bit smaller than the squares you're going to adhere them to. And that's intentional because they don't want any of the fusible to get off of the edge of the square and onto your ironing surface. So I used my cup to draw around and made my circle on the paper side of my fusible. All right, then you will line, now, this is one way I'm going to tell you here. You at this point, you could just line it up on here, and as you can see, there's a little bit of fabric outside the line, outside the size of the square, and iron that on. But there's also another thing you can do, and it's not so important on this small of an applique, but if you're doing a larger piece, you might want to do a process called windowing, and that means you're going to cut out the center and just leave about 1/4 of an inch around the surface that you will be adhering it to. Now, if you're just going to adhere it on, iron it on, and this is a permanent product, a permanent adhesive product, you may not even need to stitch around it at all. Some of those fusible products, though, can leave your fabrics in the spot where they're on. It can make them feel really stiff. So again, if it's not as important on something this small, but I'm going to show you the technique, and you may want to practice on some scraps and feel the difference between one that is completely full of the adhesive, the whole circle, and one that has the center cut out, so you can feel the difference. And of course, you'll do that after you take the paper off. But anyhow, how to do that windowing, you will, since you have a circle, we're going to fold it in 4ths, and then I match up my 2 remaining lines on my drawn circle. I match those up and then finish. And it's kind of the same principle as paper dolls. I just cut with my scissors about 1/4 of an inch inside that drawn line, and then this becomes scrap. So then when you unfold it, it's fairly straight. And again, this is just going to be holding your circle to your fabric long enough for you to stitch it down. I would not use this technique if you are not going to sew it down, to applique it on or stitch it on. I would do it, cover it completely if you're not going to stitch it down at all. But I would suggest that you stitch it down, because this going into a quilt is likely to be washed. And if you're doing a wall hanging or a table topper or something like that, that you're not likely to wash or wash very often, then it's not so important that you stitch it down. But okay, so once you have, if you decide to use this technique, once you've cut out your center, then you will press that on and it will look like this. Okay, then we need to cut around the drawn line, and that you're just going to cut through all your layers on the line or inside the line, it doesn't matter, because the line is not going to show. It's on the paper and it's going to be pulled off. So I just turn my scissors into the curve and turn my fabric as well. And you want to try and make that cutting edge as smooth as you can and have as few corners in your circle as possible. Then this becomes scrap. All right, so then you've got your circle, and you can peel the paper off, and that leaves that coating. It's got a little bit of a shine to it. I hope you can see it at some point anyway. There's just a little ring of this adhesive around the edge. All right, I'm going to fold this in fourths again. And I'm going to finger press it pretty good, because I'm going to use those lines to line up where it goes on the fabric. And again, the background is going to go on. I'm going to use this one because I think maybe my finger pressing will show better. The background is going to go on a color. So I'm going to finger press it in fourths, just like I did the circle. And that's going to be how I center it on the square. Now, sometimes I have to go back and press in if it's hard to see my finger pressing. Sometimes I have to go back and do it a second time. But the intention is that when I lay my folds on top of my folds, then everything is centered. So I have, and I don't know if you will be able to see that at all, but I have the fold this way on top of each other, and I have the fold this way on top of each other. Now, you can always measure it and see if you have the same measurement top to bottom and side to side, and I do. So since I'm going to put a pin in this, since I am not at my ironing surface. But if you did this at your ironing surface, then you could just press it right then. Now, another thing, when you're pressing this step, or the step that you're putting any place that your iron is going to come in contact with the fusible edge, the edge of the fusible, you'll want to use a pressing mat, because you don't want to get any of that fusible on the surface of your iron. So there are lots and lots of different applique or pressing sheets out there. If you don't have one, contact Amy at Overbrook Quilt Connection and she can hook you up with one. But you'll put that over your surface and then your iron on top. And you don't need to move your iron around, just set it on there. And whatever product you use for fusible will have instructions of how long to leave your iron on. So then, once it's fused on, then the next step is to sew it down to, or sew it around the circle. And in my case, I used thread that kind of matches it's just a neutral thread that kind of matches the background. It doesn't show really much on the background, but I also used it on a color, and it does show more there, but I don't really care because it blends in the background. Now, you could make it contrast completely if you want to, like you could use black, since we have black in our fabrics. You could use matching thread if you didn't try. I mean, you just changed your colors for each color that we're using. But I used a blanket stitch in this case. It's a pretty small one. And let me show you on here. And I also used an open-toed foot. It has a line, an opening, a little slot on one side. Mine does, right there. And then it has this red arrow in the middle. And that, so in this case, with this setting on this machine, the needle is where the red arrow is, and the edge of the fabric is where this slot is, where my fingernail is. So I lined up my edge of my fabric on the slot, and then of course my needle position is right on that center. And when you're stitching, you want when the needle is in the outermost or to the right, the farthest right, you want the needle to hit right where the edge of the circle is. And then when it comes over to the left to take that little stitch bite, it will stitch about where your needle, where your red arrow is. Now your foot may look completely different, but you need a foot that is open enough that you can see what's happening where your needle and the edge of your fabric is. Some have a cutout foot that doesn't even have this across it. But anyhow, just whatever foot for your machine, but it needs to be something you can see into pretty well. So you'll, again, you'll line up your needle when it's at its farthest right position, right on the edge of the circle, and then it will take a stitch, bite, move over to the left and take a stitch, come back. And so when I'm stitching this, I'll take about 3 stitches, and then I'll adjust my fabric under the needle a little bit, because I don't want it to kind of draw and bunch up as I go. I want it to stay really smooth so it doesn't try and, bunch up under your needle. So about every 3rd stitch, I would adjust. Now, when you stop to adjust, make sure your needle is in the farthest right position, because if you do it when you're over here and adjust it, then when it takes the stitch back, it won't be on top of its previous thread, so it'll show. And anyhow, I just go really, really slow, and it works really well. And so again, this is, if you can see that, I did the same with the background circles on the color. All right, I'm going to finish the rest of my my circle, appliquing the rest of my circles, and I'll come back and show you the next step. I have all my circles appliqued onto my squares, and when I was done with each one, I just pressed it again, just so the threads and everything just kind of relax all together and smooths everything back out again. One thing that I should have said earlier, you don't have to use a blanket stitch. You can use any of your decorative stitches. You can use a very small zigzag. You can even use a straight stitch if you don't have a zigzag. And your straight stitch, you probably want to do about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And you'll want to secure your threads. Some machines have a tack stitch that they do just several stitches real close together to start and stop. You can't really back stitch very easily with a blanket stitch with a zigzag. Again, some machines have a tack stitch that starts and stops. So, if you're just doing a straight stitch, you might want to pull your threads to the back and tie them instead of back stitching just because it's, you know, it secures them without leaving a thick back stitch on the top of your circle. Once all 6 are done, you're going to lay them out in a row, and you start with a color and end with a background, and put them in whatever order is pleasing to you. I went ahead and put my block my block 2 kind of between my 2 strips. Let me kind of show you that. Well, you can kind of see what I've got going here. I just kind of laid it out the way the block will be laid out. I'm having a hard time. I'm sorry. I'm moving around so much. I'm kind of having a hard time with right and left because I'm not used to that. But anyhow, I laid them out the way, the color combination that I wanted to use. And then you'll just sew them together. So that is super easy to finish. I'm going to finish this up. I'll come back, show you the finished strip, and then it'll be ready to put our block 2 completely together. Here is my accent strip 2 in the order that I put them in. The pattern is a little different than this, so put them in whatever order you would like. Our block is now ready to be sashed and finished, just like block 1 was. We will frame put sashing strips around, or border strips, however you want to refer to it, around our block 2. And then we will add our sashing strips in our outside background. So I will finish that part. We went over that in block 1, so I'm not going to go over that again, but I will show you the block when it's finished. Our block 2 is finished. And you do have some match points. You have, of course, the match points. So when you're sewing your border onto your block, there's one match point here where the seam of this accent strip will match your border strip here. And then you've got a couple other match points here where you are sewing and down here, same thing. You'll have seams that nest and seams that don't. So just, you know, be careful as you're sewing across them and get them all to match as well as you can. So this is our block 2. I hope you had a good time with it. And I'll see you again when we do block 3. Thank you.